Part of what we can see happening is that some people really did go the route of wedding God to modern thought. And one of the places we can see this is in the Enlightenment, the historical period that different people talk about happening at different times. But let's say sort of broadly, the 17th and 18th centuries, when people are, at least certain people, are really invested in our human reason being able to figure things out. Okay? And as Americans, we have a prime example of this, okay? The Declaration of Independence. Okay? So, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station, and here's the, for our purposes, the important part, to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. And then more. And then, again, the part that's probably the most familiar to us, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. We don't really think about that, right? You know, we've got God in there, and some of us that makes us really happy, and some of us drives us nuts, but, right, I mean, fine. But here's the point that I think for our discussion is significant. Self-evident truth. Self-evident truth. That is, there's an implicit contrast between self-evident truth and another kind of truth. Any guesses on the other kind of truth? What? Scientific, possibly. Let's think about this. Think about the things that we believe. Is the resurrection a self-evident truth? Revealed truth. The Trinity. Self-evident? I mean, could you sit in your basement and figure that one out? Can you sit in your basement now, actually, and figure out what it means?
Faith-based?
Yeah, exactly. It's faith-based truth, or truths that we would not know unless God revealed them to us. Right? Most religions, or some major religions, I should say, and Christianity is among them, have historically stated as truth things that are not self-evident, and that's part of their claim. We wouldn't know God unless God revealed God's self. We might be able to say that there is a God, right? I mean, that might be evident from nature, maybe. I mean, you know, it gets complicated. You know, right? People go to the Grand Canyon and are really convinced about God, but I'm not sure what tornadoes tell us about God, right? So part of what Christians say is that even if you can figure out that there is some sort of supreme being from nature, that doesn't get you to the God of Israel and of Jesus. So one of the things happening in the Enlightenment is the elevation or the privileging of truth that makes sense to us, that we can figure out. And a skepticism, finally you're getting that word, right? Skepticism, about truths that would need to be revealed. So if you want to go to the next slide. So one of the things that emerges out of the Enlightenment is something called deism. And this politically right now is sort of a hot button issue, right? What isn't politically right now kind of a hot button issue. But it is. And then part of the debate, right, that some people in America are having right now is the extent to which the founding fathers were devout Orthodox Christians, and the extent to which they are these things called deists, right? And everybody has their proof texts. And as a historian, it sort of drives me nuts, because it's one of those things where, like, well, there were many founding fathers. You can prove whatever you want about them by using any, you know, self-selected group of them. There were devout Christians who were founding fathers, and there were deists who were founding fathers. That's called human complexity, people. We might as well just accept it. So you're seeing why I will never be a good talking head on any political station. It's like, well, that's true, but this is also true, right? They don't want people like me. But having said that, it is true to say that one stream that emerges in the Enlightenment that is important for certain of our founding fathers, right, and other public intellectuals is this thing called deism, right, which is the belief that there is a God. Deism has the word deity in it. Okay. But it has a very specific understanding of God, and it's a God that's considered rational. The God that I could figure out from science, or from my observation of the world. The God that seems to make sense. And so what the deists would say is that God is transcendent, okay? And that God operates the world through natural laws. Some people talk about this as the clockmaker God. God started everything going, like a good clockmaker, wound it all up, and then, set it off. And like a good clockmaker, if God did God's job well, God shouldn't have to intervene. Right? Clockmakers only get back involved with the clock if the clock breaks. So for deists, God is there, God is real, God is important, but God is the first mover, set things up, set it spinning, and God doesn't intervene again. Right? Because to intervene would be to break the laws that God made in the first place, which they assume God wouldn't do. So they'll say things like miracles are not real, right? Because miracles are by definition, or at least by many definitions, an intervention into the laws of nature. Right? And that obviously has implications for Jesus, right? There's really no greater intervention than the incarnation, right? God coming to earth is a pretty big intervention. And so what deists would say about Jesus is that Jesus was a good moral, maybe the best moral teacher ever, but a moral teacher. He's not God in any strict sense. And many of them would say that the resurrection did not happen. Because again, the resurrection is a violation of the laws of nature, right? We know this. People who die stay dead. And then religion becomes essentially about morality, right? Basically, what's important about religion is it helps people be moral. Okay? It's not primarily about our standing before God. It's primarily about human morality. So you've taken away this sort of vertical line between humans and God and really focus now on the horizontal line. Again, that's not everybody at the founding of the country. It's a small group of basically elite men, but it's a small group of elite men who could, include people like Thomas Jefferson. So, also, significant people. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. But, as I said, right, deists aren't the only folks around. There are still people who care a lot about this vertical relationship between us and God. And increasingly we talk about at least some of these people as evangelicals. Again, not evangelicals like, all Lutherans are evangelical. But evangelical in the sense of how it gets sort of used in kind of common American culture. These are people who emphasize conversion, right? So they're not people who are going to say, I became a Christian at baptism. They're going to say, I became a Christian when I decided to become a Christian, which is also an important point we'll talk about in a sec. They have a certain view of the Bible. We could go on, but for our purposes, that's a little bit beside the point. But what's interesting about 19th century evangelicals is that they too, particularly in the first part of the 19th century, seem to suggest that God operated largely in ways comprehensible to humans. Okay? One of the shifts that happens in the early part of the 19th century is a shift from Calvinism in America to Arminianism in America. Okay? It's Arminian, A-R-M-I-N-A, not Armenian, which is, right, a people group. But the kicker there is a shift from a God who predestines some people to be saved and some people to be damned, and a God who gives people free will. Okay? Now, there are lots of theological reasons. Okay, now I'm more of a Methodist than I'm a Presbyterian. Although, right, you get a room full of the kind of Presbyterians I hang around with, and I'm probably more comfortable with the notion of predestination than any of them, which is sort of funny, but that's a whole other story. So there's lots of theological reasons to prefer a notion of free will to a notion of predestination, right? You can have a theological argument. But part of what's happening in the early part of the 19th century isn't so much a theological argument as a sense that it is not moral for God to damn some people and not others. Okay? Now, again, that may not be a terrible theological argument, but just look at what it does. It says that God operates by morality as we understand morality. God operates by morality as we understand morality. God will do the right thing by our standards. Okay? Now, again, there are lots of reasons to sort of think that Calvin's doctrine of double predestination is actually biblically problematic. Okay? But in terms of sort of thinking about how people are thinking about God, again, it's a shift. Right? God will act in the world as we think God should act in the world. We've moved from a world in which people would say, if something happens and it's terrible, God may be there to help me through it. God may, guide me. God may be, refining me through it. But it's not a fundamental challenge to the notion of a good God. We're getting to a world that when something bad happens, people think it's a problem for how we understand God. God is somehow responsible, right? Because, well, we get to judge how God is. God is also rational, okay? So one of the most famous textbooks in the early part of the 19th century was called Natural Theology, published in 1802. And here we have evangelical Christians basically saying the same thing as deists. You can understand God on the basis of nature. God is rational. And we can come up with a good understanding of God on the basis of nature. The guy I've pictured there is Charles Finney, who's actually an evangelist. But his style of evangelism is also important. Charles Finney was a lawyer by training. And when he did his revivals, he basically presented a lawyer's case for God. And then people were sort of able to vote thumbs up or thumbs down on God. And again, just note what that does, right? I now, as a human being, can make a rational choice about God, and it's a somewhat distanced choice, right? Am I persuaded or not? That's a very different mindset from, again, what had been true, say, 500 years earlier, where I may not like God a whole lot, I may be indifferent to God, but I don't get to make decisions about God. I'm now making decisions, rational decisions.